The Drop the Debt campaign, now called DATA, has had some spectacular successes. America has pledged 100% debt relief to the poorest countries, as have the rest of the G7. Last month, George Bush appeared to change American aid policy. For this, we have to thank, many would argue, the thorn in the side of the IMF, Harvard University's Jeffrey Sachs, and U2's Bono. Now, here I am looking at a rock star and a professor of the dismal science, the pair of you coming together for this campaign. Bono, how did you two meet?
Well, when I got involved in the Drop the Debt campaign, we were very behind in the US, and we had to get it going very quickly. And a friend of mine, Bobby Shriver, said, look, if you want to know this argument inside out, you've got to meet Jeffrey Sachs up at Harvard. You should go there and enroll, basically, which is what I did. And I wanted to know if, we had achievable ends here. I didn't want it to be pie in the sky. I didn't want a warm, fuzzy feeling. I was looking for, a rigorous argument. And then I met this madman who told me, you're asking for this much, you should go the whole hog, 100% debt cancellation, don't let anyone put you off it.
So, Jeff Sachs, you said, hold on a second, let's go for the whole hog. Is this as a result of your own experience in debt relief in the 80s?
Well, it's a result of the simple facts, because as complicated as a lot of people try to make this issue, it's really very straightforward. You have incredibly broke, impoverished countries. They can't pay the debt. If you try to make them pay, people die. They die in large numbers. That's what's been happening for 20 years. My own experience in a lot of countries showed me that up close, but when you really look at it up close, or even in the books, you see what we're doing has just been so ridiculous, to be asking Burkina Faso and Tanzania and Malawi and countries like that to be repaying the debt when they're trying to control AIDS and malaria and TB and all of that.
Bono, can I ask you, if we were to project forward to 2020, what sort of Africa in particular would you like to see if you guys are successful in this campaign?
Well, the whole issue of development in Africa has been complicated by the AIDS virus, and really we have to get to grips with that, or for a lot of these countries, just 20 years is a joke. I mean, even thinking ahead to next year is hard enough. But there are these antiretroviral cocktails available. They're just too expensive. And if the campaign goes off right, and we get the pharmaceutical industry involved, and we get enough support from the wealthier nations, I think Africa can have, if it has, good policy, can have, there's a real future for Africa. There's some very smart African leaders that are coming through, but their position is untenable because they have this past that they've been having to deal with in terms of debt. They have the present problems, which is not being allowed, a lot of them, to trade with the United States and France and others. And then they have this sort of future catastrophe on the way with the AIDS pandemic. So I think that's, but apart from that, it's really rosy.
Jeff Sachs, can I ask you, just to pick up on the idea that Bono was talking there about trade, many people would look at your movement to drop the debt as being part and parcel of the anti-globalization movement. Is that a fair analogy? But if you're pro-trade, it's quite different.
Well, I think the people that have been out on the streets, and a lot of them are friends and supporters of some of the same things as us, have been pointing out the system's broken. But we have a particular diagnosis of what's broken, what's needed to fix it. What's broke is that you have countries dying of disease, massive pandemics of AIDS, malaria, TB. You have children that can't go to school because the governments are broke. You have debt payments that have been so high that they've siphoned off money urgently needed to address health and education and other ills. But we also think in those places, from what we've seen and from what the data shows and the statistics show, that it's not that there's been too much globalization, it's been that there's been very little globalization, if any. These are countries on the margin or just outside of the world economy. So they need to get their basic health and education in order, and we've got to help them to do that. And at the same time, they need to be able to attract the same kinds of companies that Ireland has attracted, that's made this country grow. You ask, why did Ireland have the fastest economic growth in the last generation virtually in the world, and certainly in Europe? And the answer is it attracted a lot of investment. Now, Africa's not going to start with Intel, that's for sure. But it could start with some foreign investment. So we believe in globalization, but globalization that makes sense, not globalization that kills people.
Now, Bono, can I ask you that I was reading last month that you have co-opted into your campaign some extraordinary right-wingers in America who would typically be totally against debt relief, against open-ended aid policies. How did you manage that?
Well, my instinct on this, from the moment I went to see Jeff at Harvard, I asked to meet the most conservative economist as well. And Jeff and Robert J. Barrow writes for the Wall Street Journal and whatever. And that was maybe the most important idea, actually, that I brought to all of this, was don't play politics with this. Let's involve the right. Let's maybe get to the right through the church, through the evangelical churches, through the Catholic Church. You saw the picture of me with the Pope. I mean, it's not a sexy subject, debt cancellation, so sometimes you need to make these unusual juxtapositions with photo ops to get people talking. But that was and is our position, that let's just actually... there's so many lives at play. This is too serious to play politics with. It's very unhip for me, and it has alarmed the band. And to have Jesse...
You talking to Jesse Helms?
Yeah, Jesse Helms came to a U2 show, and Edge was, had to be restrained. And but you know what? That man single-handedly turned the Hawks, if you like, around in this administration, and he publicly apologized. He said, "I'm ashamed at the way I have thought about the AIDS pandemic, and I think we should be dealing with it." And he's responsible for putting $500 million in an emergency supplemental this year, after myself and a few others ganged up on him, and that's serious money.
Now, Jeff Sachs, there is an argument, you hear it in the financial press all the time, to say giving debt relief to countries like this simply rewards delinquent dictators in Africa.
Yeah, I think it's really, again, trying to make a simple subject too complicated. When a society is so flat out broke, so flat out impoverished, that people are dying by the millions, and that if you continue to try to force debt payments from them, you kill them by millions more. And you could see the link. They just don't even have a margin of survival in these countries. Then it isn't so complicated to say we've got to find a different way to do this. Our approach that Bono and I have been advocating, and that many, many others are advocating, is that you don't just cancel the debt. You say, when the debt is canceled and there's some saving there, that has to be invested in the health and the education, and it has to be invested together with the NGO community so that they're watching it. We went to Africa in January to see whether that was happening, and we were very gratified by how the initial steps of debt relief are really working. They're really getting to the people that are sick and dying, getting to the people that are hungry, and that's the basic point.
Bono, many of these African countries, because what Jeff has said is you get the aid to the people who need it, but many African countries seem to spend a huge amount on arms. They seem to be...
They don't qualify. I mean, there are very, very strict conditionalities in place. It has to be clear and transparent process. It's actually quite a burdensome amount of conditions, but actually that's coming from the south, from our people on the ground in Africa saying, we don't want the debts cancelled if our government is not playing straight. But when they do, like in Uganda, where they have 3 times the amount of children in schools now since their debts were cancelled, from 3 million to 9 million. We saw the schools, we went along. The U.S., I'm going with the U.S. Secretary of Treasury in a few weeks.
Paul O'Neill.
Paul O'Neill, yeah, to Africa to show him what debt cancellation has done, because he was very sceptical. And we went to we went to clinics out in the field where people talked about, that they had gotten jobs as a result of that campaign. The doctors and nurses talking in those terms, and I think we're very proud and with what we saw on that trip. It was a kind of a recce trip preparing for this.
Now, you talked about Paul O'Neill, but what about the bureaucrats, let's say in the IMF, who've largely supported the status quo for the last...
Jeff's subject.
Jeff?
Well, I think they were under the thumb of the U.S. government for 20 years, which had a basic approach, which is keep the world's poor people away from our taxpayers. And the U.S. became the most miserable of all the world's donors during this period, giving the smallest proportion of our national income of any of the donors. Very few countries did spectacularly, I have to say, but the U.S. was the smallest, so nobody gets great awards for this. But the IMF and the World Bank did the bidding of their major shareholders, and they said, solve your own problems, fix your house, get your house in order, and things will be okay. But here's the basic point: when you're down around $1 a day to survive, when you're trying to survive on that little, which hundreds of millions of people are right now, it doesn't matter whether you're acting perfectly, whether you have perfect government, everything. You simply can't provide the most essential life-saving needs to fight AIDS, to keep disease under control, to get children to school. There's not enough resources there. There has to be cancellation of the debt, and there has to be more help from the outside. It's basic arithmetic, and that's really what we keep finding every time we look at it. It's basic arithmetic.
It's money, and you asked about in 20 years' time, what would we like to see? And of course we want an increase in aid. Oddly enough, 20 years ago, there was a thing called the Pearson Commitment, which was that a percentage of GDP, which at that time was around about 0.2, 0.3, would increase to 0.7, and they felt that that was the sort of commitment that people needed to make to make a dent in the world's poor. And rather, the opposite happened over the last 20 years, and the wealthier countries slipped down to less than 0.1, where the U.S. has been until a few weeks ago when we pushed them up on aid.
Let me put those numbers in perspective, if I could, just for a moment. What does it mean to give 0.7 of 1%? It means that the rich would give 7 cents out of every $10 of their income. That was the goal. It doesn't sound so extraordinary. 7 pennies out of every $10 of income. We're not even doing that. In the United States, we're giving 1 penny out of every $10 of our income. And that's not enough to keep people alive. It's not enough to head off this AIDS pandemic, which 20 years ago had a very small number of people and now has 40 million people living with AIDS, and 25 million have already died. So we're talking about a scale of a problem that requires a scale of an answer.
And Liz O'Donnell here fought for that, that Ireland is now pledged to ramp back up to that Pearson commitment, and I think that's...
Well, speaking of Liz O'Donnell, we spoke about the American government. Bono, here, what do you think of the response of our own government to issues of third world aid, third world development?
Well, I have a certain thinking this is the capital. I mean, wherever we went in Africa, there were paddies jumping out of the bushes. I mean, at every level, wonderful women, Sister Anne, these people who are heroes, really, on the ground in Africa. There's so many of them speak of Ireland in hallowed terms.
These
who are not even Irish, people who are taught by the Irish. So there's a real... We should be proud of that. We also should be proud of this commitment to go to 0.7. I think that's really good. But our job, and we have the work cut out for us, is actually not here, and is in the United States. We really have to push them over the line.
Now, can I ask you about the change in mentality in the States since September 11th? It's almost an opportunity, September 11th, as a wake-up call.
Yeah, well, I always say and said to George Bush that there were, our analysis of that week wasn't just the shock of that incredible, awful moment of watching the Twin Towers turn to dust, but actually a few days later, seeing people dancing in the streets of Jakarta celebrating that. And I'm sure that was a moment where the American mindset will never come back from that. And I think there's a will not to be the bad guys anymore. They don't want to be the bad guys. This is the country that liberated Europe, and they see themselves in those terms. They don't understand that they weren't giving very much aid. And when we tell them, Americans get angry. And of course, the reason they weren't, they will argue, is because it was so badly misused. So what we worked at with the administration this time was, look, if we can show you real progress, will you gather around it? A sort of hothousing principle, and that's what they've jumped on, and that's where we're at right now.
Bono and Jeffrey Sachs, thank you both very much for joining me.